You know, you get older and you get philosophical about why you got into your career field. I just love the interaction of people. I love to relate to an audience. I love what I get back from an audience, whether it's applause or attention, or more than that, body movement and swing. It's part of the human nature when you talk about music being in every human being to some degree.
On Monday nights at Arthur's Tavern in the West Village, you might find, as I did, today's guest leading a swing band.
Well, okay, my name is Edward Joseph Polcer. My name professionally is known as Ed Polcer. I am concluding a long career as a jazz musician, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Ed is in his early 80s and has been playing music since he was a kid.
We couldn't afford a piano, so my folks bought a xylophone, and I learned how to play the xylophone. And so by the time I was 6 and my sister was 4, we were performing talent contests. They had a lot of talent contests at that time in Jersey. So I learned very young that I was accepted in front of people. They love me.
Yeah.
And how can you fight being loved by all the people?
And he kept at it. From xylophone, he moved over to trumpet, which he played throughout his youth and high school and college at Princeton, where, side note, he also played baseball good enough for a tryout with the Brooklyn Dodgers. But baseball was a pursuit he chose to drop after being invited to perform at Grace Kelly's wedding in Monaco.
And here I am, 18 years old, my second trip to Europe, and I'm playing for royalty. The wedding of the century. I'm going to tell you the hoopla surrounding it.
After graduating college, Ed went into the Air Force. Eventually, when he got out, with a family in tow and the attendant responsibilities, finding himself in a career in business that took him through to his late 30s. But along the way, the music never left him. Weekends and nights he played and played, standing out amongst the greats of the day, including Benny Goodman, whose phone call to Ed would drive new life into the dream.
So Benny Goodman was the king of swing. He had
swing.
people dancing. I didn't think I would end up being a full-time musician. It took over.
I sat with Ed at his apartment in Brooklyn to hear more about his active, diversified, and eventful life. Please enjoy Ed Polcer.
Eddie Condon's was a great jazz club in New York. Eddie Condon was a guitar player, and he's in 1945, they opened a jazz club called Eddie Condon's down in the Village, and that he was pretty much the front man and leading the band there. And that was when I was back in high school. It was one of the bands that attracted my attention was the Eddie Condon band. So he passed away in 1973, and since we had been playing kind of the same approach to jazz as he did, we went to his widow and asked permission to use his name to reopen the club. And so we reopened it in 1975 and ran for 10 years.
Wow.
And it sort of projected right West 54th Street near all the hotels. A very successful jazz club. And it sort of projected classic jazz another 10 years than it wouldn't have. It was next door to Jimmy Ryan's, so we had a mini swing street there. So.
Nice. And so when you first came to New York from Jersey, what drew you here? What brought you here?
Basically, again, first off, I got an engineering degree from college. Okay, so I had a job in New York waiting for me at Combustion Engineering because I thought I was going to become an engineer because I was good in math and physics in high school, and they said, well, it was a great thing to do in the 50s to break out of the lower middle economic class. It was to get ahead in the world and whatever you wanted to call it. But I never really liked all of that. But I came to New York because I had a day job here, and also because of the music scene, which I had heard for years, and came into New York many times to see all this great music. So for every reason, I became a New Yorker. Mm-hmm. It was interrupted with 3 years in the Air Force, where I graduated college in 1958 and 1960. I was in ROTC at college, so I went into the Air Force for 3 years as a ground officer. I would never become a flyboy, as we called it. They took me up in a T-33 trainer and proceeded to do loops, and I almost threw up. I mean, so I was not going to be a pilot.
Yeah. So let's keep that on the ground.
I had 3 years stationed at West Hampton Air Force Base, West Hampton, Long Island, and it was the main defense base protecting the New York area. They had a missile station out at Montauk, and so it was a pretty impressive 3 years in the Air Force.
Yeah, wow. And so what year was this?
1960 through the beginning of 1963.
Wow. And then after that, you went back to... What happened after that?
Well, for 10 years, I maintained a day job. I had in the Air Force, I got into procurement and purchasing, and I kind of liked that. Came out, and instead of getting into engineering, I became a purchasing agent for West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company and a few other companies. And again, I was playing a lot of gigs. And, I was averaging probably 3 or 4 musical gigs a week and also having a day job. And it was, a little bit physically stressful. And make a long story short, 10 years after I got out of the Air Force, I got a call from Benny Goodman to go play with him. And there's a long story attached to that, how I was recommended by Bobby Hackett to him. But I figured if Benny Goodman figured I was good enough to play for him, maybe I had a shot at being a full-time musician.
Cool. And tell us about Benny Goodman.
Benny Goodman to me was great. At that point, he was late in his career, and he was starting to introduce a lot of younger players, which I think was a very nice, humane thing to do. People always paint a picture of him being such a taskmaster and kind of an introvert personally, but he was always fair to musicians, and he was very nice to me. I mean, my favorite Benny Goodman story was the first gig I played with him. I don't have much stage fright in general. I mean, I'm pretty uncomfortable right from the time I was a kid, 4 years old, playing a xylophone for audiences. But my first gig with him, I was pretty tense. And the curtain opens, and there's a couple of thousand people in the audience. I'd never played for that many people in my whole life. And here I am with Benny Goodman. His opening tune was his theme song, which is called Let's Dance. And it's pretty much ba, 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 ba. In other words, no vibrato. I was shaking so hard that my horn said, da, da, da. He looked over at me and he just smiled because he knew what I was going through.
Yeah.
I was literally stage fright.
Right, yeah.
So anyway, but Benny was always fair to me. He used to come into Condon's as well because, again, I played with him in 1973. And Condon's was open from 1975 through 85, and he'd come in there occasionally. He's a good friend.
Good. That's nice to hear. And what was he known for in his time?
Well, they called him the King of Swing, okay? Again, here we can get into a whole other story about how critics themselves have to define everybody. And okay, he was a swing musician. Okay. He didn't mind being called King of Swing. At that time, when he was popular, it was the rock music of the time. People were dancing, just like I saw you dancing the other night. I want to ask you what you thought about what the other night, too, when you were at Arthur's Tavern. But Benny, he was known to be a king of swing.
King of swing. So fast, kind of fun, dancey jazz.
Yeah, people, when one of the famous quotes of him and Louis Armstrong, when they asked him, "What kind of music are you playing?" He said, "We're playing dance music." Not regardless of what you're calling it. We love to see people moving, the bodies moving to us. We're playing dance music, just like you got up and danced the other day.
Couldn't help myself.
Well, that's part of my. You get older and you get philosophical about why you got into your career field, I just love the interaction of people. I love to relate to an audience. I love what I get back from an audience, whether it's applause or attention, or more than that, body movement and swing. It's part of the human nature. When you talk about music being in every human being to some degree, it's always been part of the mating thing. People, you get up and dance with somebody. You can hold somebody. So Benny Goodman was the king of swing. He had people dancing.
Yeah. And what was his era? Like, when was he determined the king of swing?
Most of it happened even before. I mean, let's put it this way. His Carnegie Hall concerts were like 1937 and 38. I was born in 1937, so I didn't catch him at his peak. So I caught him later on. So it was the music of the 30s. Yeah. I mean, it was the music of the 1930s.
Yeah.
He was, and this is not really talked about that much. He and Eddie Condon and who was the other one that I always like to think? There was another musician who put black and white musicians on the bandstand for the first time. People at that time, they could accept the concept in jazz or in music that you could have a mixed band, but they didn't want to look at it on stage. So Benny Goodman in his concerts at Carnegie Hall, Eddie Condon in his concerts at Town Hall, always had a mixed band. And I don't know how conscious they were of that. I think they just said if you played good music, you could be hired and played. Yeah, and this is the world that I grew up in and have tried. We maintain the same thing at Eddie Condon's. You just did it. Yeah. You didn't. This is all thinking about it afterwards and being politically correct. We were pushing the envelope without even trying.
Right. You were working on something higher ground, above all.
Yeah, we're oblivious to that.
You're speaking music
language.
Well,
it's people like Goodman and Condon who paved the way to make it much more comfortable. I mean, I could just slide into it. I mean, when I first got out of college and came to New York, first got out of the Air Force, I lived in for a time being, it was always very brief in New Jersey, but my roots were Jersey, and a lot of Jersey jazz fans knew me, so I put on a lot of concerts as leader in New Jersey. I'd bring New York musicians into New Jersey, black, white, didn't matter.
Yeah. And how did Benny find you? You mentioned that he reached out to you. How did he know who you were? Did he see you play, or how did that happen?
How did he know about my playing? I don't think he ever heard me. Part of what I was saying, even just finished saying, was I would bring New York musicians, some of the greatest ones, out to New Jersey for concerts. I would be the leader, and I'd hire, Teddy Wilson on piano, really all the Sonny Greer on drums. Among them, I had brought Bobby Hackett, who was a great jazz cornet player, and I'd bring him out, and I befriended all these guys because in the 60s, and we're talking all through the late 1960s, jazz was really hurting in New York, and a lot of the musicians would take gigs out in Jersey just because the money was better, and they were really hurting for gigs. So I was able to befriend a lot of the really established musicians. I mean, I got pictures on my wall in the other room I can show you, playing with Roy Eldridge and Clark Terry and all the greats. And one of them was Bobby Hackett. Okay, so Hackett was working for Goodman in 1973, and he got booked to go to Europe or someplace with his own band, Hackett did, and that's why he recommended me to Benny, nice. Benny Goodman.
Yeah.
I tell you, that day was one of the funniest days. I'm not funny, but I pick up the phone, and he said, hello? He said, hello, this is Benny. I said, Benny? Benny who? Oh, Benny Goodman. Okay. Like he said, this is Benny, like I'm supposed to recognize his voice.
Yeah.
He was in another little world of his own,
Yeah.
Anyway, so my befriending Bobby Hackett got paid back to me by him recommending me to Goodman.
Nice. I love that.
And really at that time, it was like there was so much going on in the world in the 60s and the 70s that changed the way the world was when I was like back in high school and in college. The 50s were the tail end of a whole different era. But younger people were being, in the music business, were really coming to the fore. There's always been room for younger people, but the established core in the jazz field, they began reaching out and encouraging a lot of these younger players.
It was promising to you as a young person to have
Yeah,
that
well,
opportunity.
I was young. I was 36 when I played with Goodman.
Yeah.
That's relatively young,
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Trust me.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that you started out as a playing xylophone.
Oh, yeah.
Can we talk about that, kind of the origins, and then
Well, essentially,
how it evolved?
my father was an amateur trumpet player. He came over from Austria-Hungary at the age of 4, and Paterson, New Jersey was kind of one of the hubs for a lot of people coming from Hungary, Austria-Hungary. In fact, half of his town in Hungary, it's now Bakonyako, it's now part of Hungary, but it was part of Europe that whenever the French won, it became French, and whenever the Austrians ran, and then when the Hungarians won, I mean, it was always that city, that town was always in transition. So at the time my father came over as a Hungarian, he was really Austrian, and the Austrians were the workers, and the Hungarians were ruling the town, and so half of the Austrians left Bakonyako. Where did they come? They came to Paterson, New Jersey, because some of their relatives had come over and friends. They found jobs for them in the mills, the silk mills in Paterson. So my father was a Hungarian, and he played in a polka band. He called it a hunky band, which is what they called Hungarians, hunkies. And I would go as a kid and sit next to him. He'd be playing for picnics in the park in the summertime. It was an amateur band, but everybody be dancing. Everybody having a good time. So I was already subconsciously aware of people enjoying music. Okay. So I get to start grammar school at the age of 4, which is pretty unheard of, but I was very smart.
Precocious young lad.
And pretty smart. Well, very smart for my age. And they found out that after a year of kindergarten, I knew everything that the first graders knew already. And they were going to skip me in first grade. And one of the teachers very wisely said, he's going to be really out of sync with those other kids. He's going to be 2 years younger than the average kid. Why don't you give him something to occupy himself, something challenging? We couldn't afford a piano, so my folks bought a xylophone. And I learned how to play the xylophone. And so by the time I was 6 and my sister was 4, we were performing for talent contests. They had a lot of talent contests at that time in Jersey. So Eddie and Betty Polcer were in great demand to play. We must have played for 10 different churches.
6 years old and 4 years old.
And a funny thing, another funny story, my father, whenever we do a talent contest, he'd say, okay, you got to guarantee my kids at least second place in the talent contest. So my father, somehow we always got at least second place or first place in the talent contest.
That's a good deal.
But so I learned very young that I was accepted in front of people. They love me.
Yeah.
And how can you fight being loved by all the people?
Right.
And then I get further on, since my father's a trumpet player, so as soon as my second set of front teeth came in, you can't play the horn they don't want you to play on your baby teeth because you wreck your whole mouth. So I got about 4th or 5th grade, and I started playing the trumpet. And since I went to high school, a guy recognized I was going to be a classical trumpet player. I mean, I was playing Carnival of Venice already, which is a classic, hard to play solo with the Paterson Civic Band. At 13, I was already playing with an adult band, but I got to high school, and at the age of 13, this other fella, a drummer whose father used to play in some of the big bands, recognized that I was a good trumpet player. So he said, "Would you like to play in my Dixieland band?" They called it the Knights of Dixieland. He was 2 years ahead of me. So already, freshman year in high school, I'm playing for high school dances. Again, everybody loves me. What's not to love? I think it's a good idea that people start on a piano or a xylophone where they can actually see the notes instead of these notes just being in your head. Okay, you've got that keyboard in front of you. You know what a chord ba-da-da-da is because you can see those notes.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good idea that kids start that way rather than on violin or guitar.
Yeah, yeah. And it worked out for you. And so you got used, you learned young, you played young, you performed young, you saw music in your house, you saw people having fun.
Yeah,
I've
had all these things going on.
Yeah, yeah. And so that just continued to evolve. You trumpet, and then college, Air Force, your job doing procurement.
Yeah.
I'm interested in, it's really neat the way you've described it, because I think there's a lot to be learned, and it's very inspiring when you hear about someone who does a side gig. Their passion project is on the side. You mentioned you have 3 gigs a week.
I didn't think I would end up being a full-time musician. It took over.
It took over. Yeah, so let's get there. How did that happen?
Well, I think it evolved. You know, you look in hindsight now. You don't, while you're doing it, you don't even think of it this way.
You were doing it because you wanted to do it, and you were finding the time to do it at night and on the weekends. You were playing gigs while you had a full-time job.
Yeah. I mean, you backtrack. I mean, again, I get to college. Again, I wanted to be a major league ball player. Okay, so I got a scholarship to Princeton. If it hadn't been the time where they were reaching out, after World War II, there was the GI Bill. People coming back, veterans coming back, could pretty much be guaranteed to be able to get to whatever college they could qualify for. They'd have to pass tests, but they couldn't just go to any school. But the colleges started reaching out, and they were, even Princeton, Harvard, Yale, the elite schools were reaching out to get kids from high schools. So since I was all-state baseball in Jersey. I was president of student council. I was top of my class, and I played jazz. So I was a typical somebody that Princeton might be interested in. So I was given a full scholarship to Princeton. I would have never gone to Princeton. So, but for me, Princeton was at that time the first All-American ever to be All-American and go to Princeton was Dick Kazmaier. So I knew about him. And Stan Rubin and his Tiger Town 5 were broadcast on every Saturday at Ted Husing's bandstand. So I knew only 2 things about Princeton. I didn't know about all the rich man and all that kind of stuff. I knew Dick Kazmaier and I knew Stan Rubin. So I got to play with Stan Rubin, and I went. And first year he booked our band, the Nassau Jazz Band, to go on a studentship to Europe. My God, here I am, 18 years old, and I'm leading the Nassau Jazz Band on 2-month tour of Europe. Next year, 1956, April of 56, I would have made varsity shortstop at Princeton, and that was the beginning of baseball season at college. In April, Stan Rubin says, I've been invited to play at Grace Kelly's wedding in Monaco, where Grace Kelly, the movie star, married Prince Rainier of Monaco. He said, "Can you go with me?" And here I am, 18 years old, my second trip to Europe, and I'm playing for royalty at Grace, the wedding of the century. I mean, really, up to Princess Di and a few more recent ones. That was the wedding. I'm going to tell you the hoopla surrounding that thing. We came back from that thing. We were on the Ed Sullivan show, the Ernie Kovacs show, everything. We were the toast of New York when we came back. So what's the fight? I'm only wanting to give you this background.
No,
this is
great.
What's going through
Keep
my
it going.
head.
Wait, I want to hear more about the wedding.
Well, I'll tell you another funny story about the wedding. You want to hear a funny story? Aristotle Onassis, the great wealthy Aristotle Onassis, who ended up marrying Jacqueline Kennedy after John was killed, richest man in the world, had a yacht that was bigger than the royal yacht of Prince Rainier of Monaco.
Uh-oh.
So he sails into the harbor with his big yacht, showing his chest out and everything, ego going like crazy. And he was not invited to the what they call rehearsal dinner, the dinner before the wedding, where only the in group ever gets to go to. He was not invited, so his nose got out of joint. So he heard we're going to play at the wedding. What did he do? He called Stan Rubin, and the day before the wedding, he had us play on his yacht. He had to get his zinger into the royal people.
Before.
So I played on Aristotle Onassis' yacht. I'm at a date with Miss England. I mean, and it was just a wealthy. We played for a whole week. Gave a concert for all the Monegasques in the town square, 2,000 people around us.
What was the wedding like?
Well, it was a great wedding. I mean, we played the reception. I wasn't at the wedding. I
but you were at the party.
played the reception.
You were the
all
music at the
movie
party.
stars. Rita Gam, I remember meeting her and a few others.
And so you played your finest swing dance at that.
Yeah,
at that
well,
party.
we only, they had 4 or 5 bands that played at it, but we just did our number, probably half an hour of playing.
Cool. That's cool.
These are very nice things to have as your resume. I mean, in the past, but when you're going through it, you just go through it.
Right. And
So I led a band for 2 months in Europe. I loved it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the perspective it gave me on looking at the States from a other standpoint, it was very interesting. Just having spent that time in Europe.
I bet. And then not to mention I'm just imagining what that must have felt like to be aware of the fact that you could travel the world and perform for people who loved what you were doing, and then to come back and and then to see the more conventional route you could have taken. It must have been hard to stay.
Well, yeah. Well, I did it because I got married and had a daughter. The marriage ended in divorce in 1973 when I went to music full time. But the point was, I had to take care of business, so I had to, and I had the training as an engineer and purchasing and stuff like that. So I kept doing that, because that's what I thought I had to do. And if it hadn't been my timing and my befriending a few jazz musicians and Benny calling, when Benny called me, that was when I made up my mind, I can try it. And then again, fortuitously, I've been very lucky. I've had some great breaks, was meeting my partner, business partner, Red Balaban, who had the money to reopen Condon. So 2 years after I become a full-time musician, I'm now a regular, playing 6 nights a week at Eddie Condon.
And this is when you're about mid-30s.
Yeah, that was 1975, so I was 38.
38. So after college, until you were 38, you were a full-time career man, engineer, procurement person, and you were playing gigs at night, and it was all part-time passion. And you did it because you loved it. But you never really thought that it would be full-time, and then all of a sudden these things start happening 15 years later, basically, and then you think, okay, I can do this full-time, I'll take a risk.
I would think, in hindsight, it probably was building over that before Benny called me.
Sounds like it.
Because, my marriage was becoming more of a challenge, and because I think my ex-wife expected me to give up childish things and become a typical Princeton executive in New York. So in all fairness to her, even though I told her I think I want to be a musician full time, so it was a big decision to make it to try it full time. I didn't know what the heck, but it was at a good time where I could work 6 nights a week.
Yeah.
I mean, at that point we were being paid as a sideman $230 a week, which if you multiply that times 7, which is what the cost of living has gone up from 75, that's like $1,700 a week.
Nice.
For a jazz musician. That's $85,000 a year. I mean,
So how did that feel when the transition happened? Because it must have been, I imagine doing the part-time while you have a full-time job and then a part-time musician job was a lot.
well, first off, I started out at Condon's just being a sideman in the band for 2 years, and actually the club was starting to, quote, lose money, and I had all this other management training from my business career, and I went to my partner, and at that point he was the sole owner, and I began saying all kinds of things going wrong. He said, "Okay, I'm about ready to go out of business. You've been telling me how I should run this club." He said, "I'm going to get rid of my other manager. Would you like to manage the club?" I said, "Yeah." And within 3 months, it was put into the black. We're making profits. I found out that they had a scheme going between the bartenders and the waiters. At that point, it wasn't computerized. Your check was not computerized, and the waiters were giving one check to the people and turning in a phony check, so that a night where we should have been making $2,000 or $3,000, we were making $1,000 or $1,200. So,
gosh.
and that was why we were losing money. The place was packed right from the start, and how can you be losing money?
Yeah.
So anyway, I turned it around, became manager, and eventually became part owner, my wife and I. And so I had, again, that mix of business and music. So then I ended up leading the band there 3 nights a week, and my partner would lead 3 other nights. So it was great.
I saw you. I was lucky to see you the other night, Monday, at Arthur's Tavern.
Yes.
With the Grove Street Stompers.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, you mentioned over the microphone that's been going on for over 50 years.
Yeah, first time I went there was 1958 when I got out of college, and they were having sitting in then.
Yeah. And this is Arthur's Tavern, for listeners, Arthur's Tavern in the West Village. So you've been playing there for 50, Grove Street Stompers, Arthur's Tavern, West Village for 50 years.
Yep. And I'm not the regular. For years, I didn't play there because I led my own band. I toured all over the country, and Arthur's Tavern was always there, a friendly place. I knew all those guys. Some of them, Pete, the guy who's going to be leading tomorrow night, Pete Balance, has been there for all 50 years.
Wow.
And he leads the band usually. And again, I was going to ask you what you thought of the band. What was your impression? I know you got up and danced, you were having a good time, but what did you think was going on the bandstand?
Well, I'll preface with, I'm not a musician. I don't have a lot of experience.
No, that's why I'm asking you.
Okay, so I love music,
Yeah.
and I love the feel of Arthur's Tavern because it feels to me authentic, old-fashioned, part of a New York that I never lived in. And so I feel like it's a portal to the past in a wonderful way. And so I'm very happy to spend time there in general. The music was very fun for me to watch. I was sitting right, as you might remember, right at the edge of the stage, and it was very pleasant music. Eventually, as you pointed out, I was dancing because it was a feel good music, song after song, and it felt like everyone up there, it felt like was happy to be there and was participating. And you seemed to be working together nicely. And it looked like you were all having fun.
Great. You gave me every reason that keeps me playing.
Oh, good.
We resonated with you, and it's visual. It's us enjoying ourselves, us playing some pretty understandable music. We did vocals. We did a whole bunch of other things. and we were having fun. So in other words, a lot of people who are new to watching a jazz band, they're really looking visual. They're listening with their eyes. If you're having a good time. And also, it gives me confidence playing the kind of music we're playing. We were playing songs that were written in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 20s. Mm-hmm. And that kind of music has always been good for me. They were show tunes. Yeah. They all originated from shows, right. Mainly the Great American Songbook. And so without fighting a battle, I've always liked resonating with people.
Yeah.
I mean, it steered me away from becoming a bebop musician. It steered me away from post-bop and all the things that the critics keep telling the public what they should like. In other words, it's like an art, modern art. I've played for the opening of Jackson Pollock exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. And what happened was Jackson Pollock, when he was creating his drip paintings and everything else, was listening to Eddie Condon music while he was doing avant-garde. But the critics always tend to want to tell the public what they should be doing. This is new. Everything is new. Make a long story short, when I walk on a bandstand at Arthur's with that band on that night, everything was new. I was cutting edge. I don't even like being said I'm a jazz musician. I'm a musician. You know what I mean? And most musicians feel that way.
Yeah. No, I think, well, you mentioned earlier the transference of energy and the intimacy that music allows, and that we all have music in us. It's nice to hear that, because I feel the same, and I'm not even a musician, but I am moved frequently by music whenever I listen to it, and it's played a huge part of my life. As a listener, and so to see it live for people who are so talented and passionate about it as you are, is always enjoyable, particularly in a small setting like that, where you feel like you and I were literally having a conversation while in between songs. Yeah. And so you go to a big show, you don't get that, and so I love the feeling of the neighborhood place, and it was really neat to watch you and your bandmates communicating, because I noticed that. You were leading the band that night with the trumpet at the front of the microphone, and your clarinet was on the left, pianist and the vocalist to your right, drummer and bassist. And when you would, you would do a solo, and when it was your turn to kind of transfer, pass the baton, so to speak, to the pianist or to somebody else, you would sort of point at your.
I had to, because I was playing. The only way I could direct traffic.
Yeah.
Is to lean back, okay, you got the bass chorus and stuff.
But you pointed with your trumpet.
Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of faded your trumpet over to whoever was next. And I thought that was really fun for me to visualize, talk about visualization. It was kind of neat to see that form of communication going on.
It gets into collective improvisation. If you Google that expression, it's a band playing for the first time. We never played together with those exact 5 pieces. It's the first gig my wife played ever, the full gig. We've been working together in duos.
So your wife is the pianist?
Yeah, Judy Kurtz. She's done off-Broadway shows. She's done cabaret. But she's only learning how to play the piano right now. I mean, the last year or two. My son has been teaching her.
Wow. And
so when we got the call that day that the piano player couldn't make it in because of the snow, I said, okay, Judy, you're on the gig. So I'm dealing with that. I'm dealing with a clarinet player who I've played with in Stan Rubin's band on Swing 46, which is every Wednesday at Swing 46 in New York. I know him from there. I've known Brian Nalepka, the bass player, for 40 years. He's the one who recommended me to Columbia Artists when I took my band touring. And Giampaolo Biaggi, the Italian drummer, I've known him also 30 years or more. But that mix just occurred that day. We had confidence that we knew the tunes.
Yeah.
I had confidence the bass player could play in Judy's keys because she needed the music to play on piano. So we just made it happen. Yeah. But that's the pure joy of what my life has been, is collective improvisation. And I know from leading a band that your band is going to sound much better if you can feature each player in the band and make them heroes.
Yeah.
Hey, that was a great bass solo. That was a drum solo. Look, that was Giampaolo Biaggi on the drums,
Yeah.
Yeah. So because I felt good when I was made the hero and did my solo feature with Benny Goodman.
Sure.
I mean, I learned all this stuff.
Sure.
The best way a leader can lead a band is make everybody in the band feel good.
Yeah. Well, that's applicable, I think.
So that's what you saw.
Yeah, of course. Tell us about what jazz means.
Well, jazz has got so many different styles within it. I cannot describe what jazz is in its totality without spending 3 hours talking about the different styles. I can tell you that the basic essence of jazz is collective improvisation.
Love
That's the way in New Orleans, they had different ethnic groups getting together on one bandstand. They had a leader who directed traffic or made some arrangements. And within that context, you usually had a rhythm section and you had a couple of horn players. So what you saw was at its purest what jazz is about. When you get into a big band, you have to have arrangements or it's going to sound like a pet shop. I mean, you know, if you have 4 trumpets and 4 saxes and two trombones and so you got all these arrangements, which is what Benny Goodman and Harry James and all those people in the 30s brought to the big bands.
Yeah.
You know, you have an arrangement.
Yeah.
But what you're doing up there, what you saw was me playing melody notes, piano player playing the chords, the bass player playing the rhythmic dung 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 dung, the drummer adding that swing thing, and the clarinet or reed player, he was going to bring his sax, and then he decided just to bring his clarinet. Listening to what I'm playing, not trying to play a solo while we're playing collectively. I'll play he'll answer ba ba da 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 ba 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 da 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 da. That makes it understandable. So that's collectively feeding off of each other.
Yeah, it's kind of like a conversation in that sense.
Yeah. So, but as things evolved into the bebop era, there's a lot of players didn't even understand what collective improvisation really meant. Because, I mean, as far as the horn players listening to each other and giving and taking, sure, it's collective if you're listening to the rhythm section, but soloing became important. You couple that with after World War II, vocalists became it almost became a feature of vocal. And yes, everybody likes the sound of a human voice, and if you can sing a song, you can resonate with people. But the vocalists took over, and today's world, you almost have to have vocalists. And you couple that with the Les Pauls working on amplified guitars, and coming out in the rock era, which happened to start somewhere around 1956 with Rock Around the Clock, the trumpets and the trombones were pushed aside, and all you have is guitars, really, and maybe a few saxes playing if you're playing blues. So what is jazz? It's all of these things, and it could take many forms.
Right. Yeah, that's really, thank you for that background. I love the sound of the trumpet.
Yeah.
It's my favorite.
So do I.
Yeah. You do? Hey, you're also a vocalist. You were singing the other night.
I'm a pretty amateurish vocalist, but I can carry a tune.
Yeah.
Again, it's audience contact.
Sure. Yeah.
Kidding around.
Yeah.
You know, my 1939 rap tune, Blues My Naughty Sweetie Gives to Me. I mean, stuff like that, you know.
Yeah. And so
I don't know if I answered your question. What is jazz?
No, I mean,
it's impossible.
It's a good example of me being an amateur with that broad of
Well,
a
most
question.
people are.
Yeah, which I found because I've heard jazz that I really like, but it's so, I think to what you said in your answer is that it's so broad that it's kind of hard to approach if you don't know anything.
Right.
And so you have to go see a performance through people who know what they're what they're doing and what's worth sharing.
Right.
Otherwise, it's kind of hard to crack the shell as a beginner listener even to jazz. So, you have, in your experience being in New York for so long, and I'm fascinated by the history of the city culturally.
It's amazing, isn't
culturally.
it? Every way the city has evolved. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah. So if you're willing to kind of just tell us how, in your experience, how it's changed. I mean, that's also a broad question, but in general, sort of, what was it like back in the 60s and 70s when you had your club, and how has it evolved, having seen it over the decades?
Well, the city in general was in deep trouble in the late 60s and through the 70s. I didn't realize it at the time, but I mean, it was pornography all over the place, poverty all over the place. Bryant Park, right behind the library, which is a beautiful place, that's where I courted my wife, Judy. I mean, and meanwhile, there's remnants of pot and bums lying around. It was oblivious. I mean, when Giuliani did a lot to straighten it out, but the other mayors did a lot too. They eliminated a lot of that stuff. So the city was really in kind of trouble. We were part of the resurgence around by 1975, where it started to clean up a lot, very much. So that's the city in general. Mm-hmm. The cultural, New York has always been a cutting edge in terms of art, in terms of theater, in terms of music. So it's always been on cutting edge. Some things change, some things don't change that much. Arthur's Tavern still looks the same as it did in 1958, and it's same attitude also.
Yeah. It's just fun to imagine it, because I've only known it for 6 years, and that's only a minuscule experience. But so you mentioned earlier, and I just want to get a little bit more context for what it was like when you were doing your full-time career job as in procurement and doing music at night. Can you talk more about what that was like? What was your perspective on it all at that point in your life?
Well, I was trying to fit the mold of the businessman. I mean, Mad Men on television probably describes an awful lot of what was that the show about advertising? Yeah. It was a male-dominated business thing in the daytime. Ladies at that time were still pretty subservient. There weren't many women in management. I was wearing a suit and coming in at that time. For a brief while, I lived in Jersey, taking the train in, going in a bar car on the way home because I was under such pressure working in New York. That was a day thing, so the music part of it was kind of a release for me to be able to play on a Wednesday night or a Friday night and Saturday night. I was living almost bipolar existence. I didn't realize it was that torn.
Yeah. You were pulled in a lot of directions.
Yeah. What I'm supposed to be doing, what I'm supposed to like. Yeah, I have no complaints about the day gigs and stuff. I just, I guess I was, in my own mind, kind of an entrepreneur. I didn't like having to do office politics and working with people I didn't want to have to work with. And that carried over into music, too. For somebody giving me trouble, I don't care how good you are, bye-bye. I don't want you as part of my band. And life is too short. So, I don't know. Yeah. I can't make more of it than it was.
Yeah,
it was just my particular history.
Yeah, no.
I got a lot of management stuff. I'll tell you that. I didn't get a master's degree, but I went to NYU Graduate School Business Administration. And I did, where we did case studies of what's wrong with this company, how do you fix it, and all this stuff. So, and with working and getting the engineering approach of getting a fact question it, retest it until you've got the right answer, go back and test it again and do it systematically. I do a lot of things systematically.
Yeah.
So it put me in good stead to be co-owner of Condon's and then take a band on the road.
Yeah.
I mean, leading a band without an agent, for one thing. I mean, you are everything. You are the corporate president, you're the chief financial officer, you are head of advertising, you're head of travel arrangements, you're head of everything, you're out there, and then by the way, you have to perform. Now, or you're all of these kind of things.
Yeah.
You really are. You're everything.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a wonderful, insightful answer to what you experienced, is that because you had a decade and a half of a job that was not music,
Yeah.
but it allowed you to make a living,
Yeah.
learn how to work with people, learn how to manage, learn
Yeah,
how to be effectively.
I was able to incorporate the best
Yeah,
of that
yeah.
situation.
And I think that's a wonderful lesson and a helpful thing for people to hear, because I think it's easy to think, oh, if I'm not pursuing my passion, only my passion, or then I'm somehow giving up on it. But as your example is a testament to, you walked two worlds in parallel, and you made the most of this career, and you gave it your best, and then you realized, wait, maybe I can step off that train and go in this direction once it became a viable option for you to make money full-time as a musician. But it's not like you just leapt into that without any, irresponsibly leapt into that.
I was lucky, my timing, because music itself, the kind of music we were playing, was still quite reasonably popular, even
Yeah.
in the 70s,
Yeah.
within a smaller circle. So it wasn't like jumping off a cliff.
Right.
But it was pretty close.
Yeah. and so you mentioned you wanted to be a ball player.
Oh, yeah. I was all-state baseball in New Jersey, and I was invited for a tryout with the Brooklyn Dodgers at Ebbets Field in 1954, which is when I graduated high school, and I wasn't good enough to make it. Then I talked to the scout who were there, and he said, "Look," he said, "what are your plans?" I said, "I've got a scholarship to college." He said, "Take it." He said, "Get a good baseball coach, get to work on your hitting, and come back and see me in 4 years." And okay. And I said, I made freshman baseball at Princeton, shortstop. And I would have been varsity the next year, and it was Stan Rubin. But in the meantime, I was leading the Nassau Jazz Band, practically every weekend at that freshman year. Every year I was in college, half of the weekends or 2/3 of the weekends we were playing gigs, either at Princeton or at all the schools around. So when I got the call to go to Grace Kelly's wedding, I was either going to go play baseball at Princeton. April, I would have made the varsity probably.
Yeah.
And that's when I made the
When you made the
decision.
I got you.
Music over baseball.
Music over
They weren't
baseball.
paying salaries like they are. And I mean, you kidding me? $17 million a year
Yeah, gosh.
to strike out 73 times? I mean, gee, you know.
But you got a tryout, man. That's incredible.
Oh, it was great.
Yeah. Do you remember it?
I remember every bit of it.
Tell
yeah.
me about it.
Well, I mean, there were about 5 of us from our league, Bergen-Passaic League, that were invited in to the tryout. So we took the bus and then the subway to Ebbets Field, and they put us into Dodger uniforms, made us feel good, and took us out in the field, and we did a whole bunch of drills, speed running, trying to steal, make the move at the right point, and then they gave us fielding practice to see how quickly you were able to anticipate where the ball was going to be hit. And I was a very good fielder, so that I knew even from the batter's swing that it was going to be to the right or left of me. I knew whether the batter was timing it right, and I'd have to move to my right. And they tested your arm, and then they got you up at the plate. And of course, at that time, pitching mound was 6 inches higher. They lowered the pitching mound since then.
Oh.
Now guys are throwing their arm out pitching 95, so one compensates for the other. But at that point, an 80-mile-an-hour fastball pitched from 6 inches higher was about the same effect. Probably it was a 90 mile an hour today.
I gotcha.
And a curveball. When I first started playing ball as a kid, they didn't have batting helmets. So again, curveball starts out at your head and then breaks over the plate. Hang in there and swing in that little time. Okay. So even a lot of major leaguers have trouble with sliders and curveballs. I don't want to start naming names, but there's a lot of guys they make them out. They don't see a fastball because they know that curve is going to mess them up. So I didn't do that great in hitting.
Yeah. Do you remember how you felt? I mean, you mentioned that you don't have stage fright. You never had stage fright as a musician, but that feels like...
It was exciting.
Yeah.
Again, it was something I loved. Oh, yeah, I was probably nervous.
Yeah. I mean, that's
It's really... a long time ago. I can't remember every emotion I had. Sure, I must have been. Are you kidding? I would have been nervous like hell.
Sure. For a undertaking that's going to require their commitment, do you have any advice for someone pursuing a new project?
You mean to change direction into something?
Yeah. Let's go with that.
Well, first off, I think you'd be foolish to just say, "Oh, I think that would interest me," and then jump off the cliff into it. So I think you prepare. Certainly, I mean, the amount of preparation that a musician goes through, playing scales, playing this, getting your body in shape, that all occurred before any decision could be made. In my case. So anybody going to change career fields, they better know what they're getting, somewhat of what they're getting into.
Sure.
They got to have courage a little bit, but you've got to have. I think you have to have either a combination of liking what you're considering and also some knowledge. You just can't do it. But you you shouldn't be afraid to change career fields.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not satisfied with what you're doing.
Right.
If you're married and you got to support a family, you're talking over with your wife. I can only look at it as in my case, a conscious stepping down of economic potential, for one thing, become a jazz musician as opposed to an engineering or purchasing executive. Mm-hmm. Tremendous difference in salary, unless you make it big,
Yeah. Well, that's been great talking to you.
I hope some of it made some sense to you.
It sure did. Thanks for being on the show. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. That's it for this episode. Thank you to Aaron for the sound design, Elin Watkins for the artwork. Also, thank you to Super Yamba Band for letting us use the music on this episode. Thanks also to Ed for letting us use the music. The songs you heard during the intro and throughout were shared by Ed for this episode. Thank you, Ed. Thanks again for everyone tuning in. Feel free to give us a rating, commentary if you feel so inclined on iTunes. We'll connect again with you soon on the Jalapeno Podcast. Take care. On we go.